Welcome to the Republic of Philosophy. My name is the Republican, and today I'm going to be reading the Avesta, the Vendidad, translated by James Darmister. Now, this is a very old text, so we're going to be reading this from chapter to chapter. Published by Franklin Classics, imprint of Creative Media Partners. You can get this book on Amazon. Introduction, Chapter 1, The Discovery of the Avesta. The Avesta is the sacred book of the Parsees, that is to say, of the few remaining followers of that religion which reigned over Persia at the time when the second successor of Muhammad overthrew the Sasanian dynasty, and which has been called dualism, or Mazdaism, or Magism, or Zoroastrianism, or fire worship according as its main tenet, or the supreme God, or its priests, or its supposed founder, or its apparent object of worship, has been most kept in view. In less than a century after their defeat, nearly all the conquered people were brought over to the faith of their new rulers, either by force or policy, or the attractive power of a simpler form of creed. But many of those who clung to the faith of their fathers went and sought abroad for a new home, where they might freely worship their old gods, say their old prayers, and perform their old rites. That home they found at last among the tolerant Hindus on the western coast of India and in the peninsula of Gezeret. There they throve, and there they live still, while the ranks of their co-religionists in Persia are daily thinning and dwindling away. As the Parsees are the ruins of a people, so are their sacred books the ruin of a religion. There has been no other great belief in the world that ever left such poor and meagre monuments of a past splendor. Yet great is the value which that small book, the Avesta, and the belief of that scanty people, the Parsees, have in the eyes of the historian and theologist, as they present to us the last reflex of the idea which prevailed in Iran during the 5 centuries which preceded and the 7 which followed the birth of Christ, a period which gave to the world the Gospels, the Talmud, and the Quran. Persia, it is known, had much influence on each of the movements which produced or proceeded from those 3 books. She lent much to the first hierarchies, much to the rabbis, and much to the Muhammad. By help of the Parsi religion and the Avesta, we are enabled to go back to the very heart of that most monumentous period in the history of religious thought, which saw the blending of the Aryan mind with the Semitic, and thus opened the second stage of Aryan thought. Inquiries into the religion of the ancient Persia began long ago, and it was the old foe of Persia, the Greek, who first studied it. Aristotle, Hermopotus, and many others wrote of it in books, of which, unfortunately, nothing more than a few fragments or merely the titles have come down to us. We find much valuable information about it, scattered in the accounts of historians and travellers, extending over 10 centuries, from Herodotus down to Agathas and Procopus. It was never more eagerly studied than in the first centuries of the Christian era, but that study had no longer anything of the disinterested and almost scientific character it had in earlier times. Religious and philosophical sects in search of new dogmas eagerly received whatever came to them bearing the name of Zoroaster. Azanthus, the Lydian, who is said to have lived before Herodotus, had mentioned Zoroaster. Agaya, there came to light in those later times scores of oracles styled on the Oracula Chaldaica Sive Magica, the work of Neoplatonists, who were but very remote disciples of the Median sage. As his name had become the very emblem of wisdom, they would cover it the latest inventions of their ever-deepening theosophy. Zoroaster and Plato were treated as if they had been philosophers of the same school, and Heracles expounded their doctrines in the same book. Proclus collected 70 tetrads of Zoroaster and wrote commentaries on them. But we need hardly say that Zoroaster commented on by Proclus was nothing more than, or less, Proclus commented on by Proclus. Prodicus, the Gnostic, had secret books of Zoroaster, and upon the whole it may be said that in the first centuries of Christianity, the religion of Persia was more studied and less understood than it had ever been before. The real object aimed at, in studying the old religion, was to form a new one. Throughout the Middle Ages, nothing was known of Mazdaism, but the name of its founder, who, from a magus, was converted into a magician and master of the hidden sciences. It was not until the Renaissance that real inquiry was resumed. The first step was to collect all the information that could be gathered from Greek and Roman writers. That was undertaken and successfully completed by Barnabé Brisson. A nearer approach to the original source was made in the following century by Italian, English, and French travellers to Asia. Pietro della Velle, Henry Ford, Mandeslo Ovington, Cardin, Gabriel du Chinon, and Travier found Zoroaster's last followers in Persia and India and made known their existence, their manners, and the main features of their belief to Europe. Gabriel du Chinon saw their books and recognized that they were not all written in the same language, their original Holy Writ being no longer understood except by means of translation and commentaries in other tongues. In the year 1700, a professor at Oxford, Thomas Hyde, the greatest Orientalist of his time in Europe, made the first systematic attempt to restore the history of the old Persian religion by combining the accounts of the Mohammedan writers with the true and genuine monuments of ancient Persia. Unfortunately, the so-called genuine monuments of ancient Persia were nothing more than recent compilations referring to the last stage of Parseeism. But notwithstanding this defect, which could hardly be avoided then, and notwithstanding its still worse fault, a strange want of critical acumen, the book of Thomas Hyde was the first complete and true picture of modern Parseeism, and it made inquiry into its history the order of the day. A warm appeal made by him to the zeal of travellers to seek for and procure at any price the sacred books of the Parsees did not remain ineffectual, and from that time scholars bethought themselves of studying Parseeism in its own home. 18 years later, a countryman of Hyde, George Boucher, received from the Parsees in Surat a copy of the Vendidad Sada, which was brought to England in 1723 by Richard Cobb. But the old manuscript was a sealed book, and the most that could then be made of it was to hang it in an iron chain to the wall of the Bodleian Library as a curiosity to be shown to foreigners. A few years later, a Scotchman named Fraser went to Surat with the view of obtaining from the Parsees not only their books but also a knowledge of their contents. He was not very successful in the first undertaking and utterly failed in the second. In 1754, a young man, 20 years old, Anquelt Duperon, a scholar of the École des Languages Orientales in Paris, happened to see a facsimile of 4 leaves of the Oxford Vendidad, which had been sent from England a few years later, to Etienne Formont, the Orientalist. He determined at once to give to France both the books of Zoroaster and the first European translations of them. Impatient to set off without waiting for a mission from the government which had been promised to him, he enlisted as a private soldier in the service of the French East India Company. He embarked at Lorient on the 24th of February 1755, and after 3 years of endless adventures and dangers throughout the whole breadth of Hindustan, at the very time when war was raging between France and England, he arrived at last in Surat. where he had stayed among the Parsees for 3 more years. He began another struggle, not less hard but more decisive against the mistrust and ill will of the Parsees which had disheartened Fraser, but he came out of it victorious, and succeeded at last in winning from the Parsees both their books and their knowledge. He came back to Paris on the 14th of March 1764 and deposited on the following day at the Bibliothèque Royale the whole of the Zend Avesta and copies of most of the traditional books. He spent 10 years in studying the material he had collected and published in 1771 the first European translation of the Zend Avesta. A violent dispute broke out at once, as half of the learned world denied the authenticity of the Avesta, which it pronounced a forgery. It was the future founder of the Royal Asiatic Society, William Jones, a young Oxonian then, who opened the war. He had been wounded to the quick by the scornful tone adopted by Antiquel towards Hyde and a few other English scholars. The Zend Avesta suffered for the fault of its introducer, Zoroaster for Antiquel. In a pamphlet written in French, with a verve and in a style which showed him to be a good disciple of Voltaire, Jones pointed out and dwelt upon the oddities and absurdities with which the so-called sacred books of Zoroastria teemed. It is true that Anquetil had given full scope to satire by the style he had adopted. He cared very little for literary elegance and did not mind writing Zend and Persian and French. So the new and strange ideas he had to express looked stranger still in the outlandish garb he gave them. Yet it was less the style than the ideas that shocked the contemporary of Voltaire. His main argument was that books full of such silly styles of laws and rules, so absurd, of description of gods and demons, so grotesque, could not be the work of a sage like Zoroaster, nor the code of a religion so much celebrated for its implicity, wisdom, and purity. His conclusion was that the Avesta was a rhapsody of some modern Girube. In fact, the only thing in which Jones succeeded was to prove in a decisive manner that the ancient Persians were not equal to the luminaries of the 18th century, and that the authors of the Avesta did not read the encyclopedia. Jones' censure was echoed throughout England by Sir John Carradine and Richardson in Germany, by miners. Richardson tried to give a scientific character to the attacks of Jones by founding them on philological arguments, that the Avesta was a fabrication of modern times was shown, he argued, by the number of Arabic words he fancied he found in the Zend Avesta and the Pahlavi dialects, as no Arabic elements was introduced into the Persian idioms earlier than the 7th century. Also by the harsh texture of the Zend contrasted with the rare euphony of the Persian, and lastly by the radical difference between the Zend and the Persian, both in words and grammar. To these objections drawn from the form, he added another derived form, the uncommon stupidity of the matter. In Germany, miners, to the charge brought against the new found books, added another and new and unexpected kind, namely, that they spoke of ideas unheard of before, and made known new things. Quote, "Pray who would dare ascribe to Zoroaster books in which are found numberless names of trees, animals, men, and demons unknown to the ancient Persians, in which are invoked an incredible number of pure animals and other things, which, as appears from the silence of ancient writers, were never known, or at least never worshipped in Persia. What Greek ever spoke of Hom, of Jemshid, and of such other personage as the fabricators of that rhapsody exalt with every kind of praise as divine heroes?" End quote. Yet in the midst of the Ciceronian nonsense, miners inadvertently made a remark which, if correctly interpreted, might have led to important discoveries. He noticed that many points of resemblance are to be found between the ideas of the Parsees and those of the Brahmins and the Musulmans Musulmans. He saw in this a proof that Parseeism is a medley of Brahmanical and Musulman tales. Modern scholarship, starting from the same point, came to that twofold conclusion that, on the one hand, Parseeism was one of the elements out of which Muhammad formed his religion, and on the other hand, that the old religions of India and Persia flowed from a common source. Quote, not only does the author of that rubbish tell the same tales of numberless demons of either sex as the Indian priests do, but he also prescribed the same remedies in order to drive them away and to balk their attempts. In these words, there was something like the germ of contemporary mythology. Seldom has a man approached the truth so closely and then departed from it so widely. Antiquel and the Avesta found an eager champion in the person of Klukler, professor in the University of Riga. As soon as the French version of the Avesta appeared, he published a German translation of it, and also of Antiquel's historical dissertations. Then, in a series of dissertations of his own, he vindicated the authenticity of the Zend books. Antiquel had already tried to show, in a memoir on Plutarch, that the data of the Avesta fully agree with the account of Magian religion given in the treatise on Isis and Osiris. Klukler enlarged the circle of comparison to the whole of ancient literature. He tried also to appeal to internal evidence, an attempt in which he was less successful. The strength of his defense was seldom greater than the strength of the attack. Miners had pointed out the mythical identity of the Mount Alborg of the Parsees with the Mount of Muru in the Hindus as a proof that the Parsees had borrowed their mythology from the Hindus. The conclusion was incorrect, but the remark itself was not so. Klukler fancied that he could remove the difficulty by stating that Mount Alborg is a real mountain, nay, a doubly real mountain, since there are two mountains of that name, the one in Persia, the other in Armenia, whereas Mount Muru is only to be found in fairyland. Seldom were worse arguments used in the service of a good cause. Miners had said that the name of the Parsee demons was of Indian origin, as both languages knew them by Latin name, Deus. This was an incorrect statement, and yet an important observation. The word, which means a demon in Persia, means quite on the contrary in India, and that radical difference is just a proof of the two systems being independent of one another. Klukler pointed out the incorrectness of the statement, but being unable to account for the identity of the words, he flatly denied it. Klukler was more successful in the field of philology. He showed, as Antiquel had done, that Zend has no Arabic elements in it, and that Pahlavi itself, which is more modern than Zend, does not contain any Arabic, but only Semitic words of the Armenian dialect, which are easily accounted for by those close relations of Persia with the Aramean lands in the time of the Sasanian kings. He showed lastly that Arabic words appear only in the very books which Parsi tradition itself considers modern. And that is half of the introduction so far. And next time I'll read half of the first part of, half of the first part of the introduction. So see you next time.